Columbian exchange down into 4 categories. Diseases. Boy, you're looking good, smallpox. I'm glad you've been eliminated. Animals, plants, and people. Mr. Green, people are animals. Yeah, that's true, me from the past, but just for the sake of simplicity. Also, if you think about it, microbes are kinda animals, and plants are too. I mean, oh my god, shut up before I kill you and create a time travel paradox. Microbes, like those hairy blokes back there, were a definite negative in terms of the Columbian exchange. Terminology is hard here, but the majority of Caribbean islanders, or Native Americans, or Amerindians had exactly one response to the arrival of Europeans: death. We can't be sure how many natives died as a result of European arrival, but it was definitely more than 50%, and some estimates place it as high as 90%. Historians used to blame European brutality, which was definitely a factor, but the main culprit was disease. Smallpox is usually seen as the villain of this story, but it's more likely that a series of diseases in combination did the damage. Along with smallpox, Americans were killed by measles and mumps, typhus, chickenpox, none of which they had been previously exposed to. This astonishing decrease of population was definitely the worst effect of these diseases, both psychologically and demographically, but the secondary effects were almost as bad. For one thing, the deaths of Aztec and Incan rulers touched off wars, which in turn made it easier to spread disease because, you know, the #1 way to catch smallpox is via hand-to-hand combat. Plus, leaders kept dying. Huayna Capac, the leader of the Inca Empire, succumbed to smallpox before Pizarro even arrived. His death led to a violent succession struggle between his sons, which was won by Atahualpa, who in turn was captured and killed by Pizarro. And without that war, the Inca would have had a much better chance against the Spaniards, whose numbers were comparatively tiny. A similar thing happened to the Aztecs. The Moctezuma who eventually lost to Cortez was the nephew of a much more powerful king who died of smallpox. And the death of that great king encouraged some of the smaller states in the Aztec Empire to rebel, and some of them even fought for the Spaniards. And another side effect of disease was starvation, because there simply weren't enough people left to grow crops to feed the living. And then malnutrition made survivors that much more susceptible to disease. In short, it sucked. The transmission of disease largely went one way, from the old world to the new, but the Americans did have one gift for Europe: venereal syphilis. It showed up in Europe around 1493, and even though Europeans are very fond of ascribing syphilis to each other, Italians called it the French disease, the French called it the disease of Naples, Poles called it the German disease, Russians called it the Polish disease. The truth is, venereal syphilis was spread by sailors who'd returned from the Americas. In fact, in his book The Columbian Exchange, Crosby tells it like this: "Sailors, by the nature of their profession, are men without women, and therefore men of many women. We can imagine no group more perfectly suited for guaranteeing that venereal syphilis would have worldwide distribution." Who says history books are boring? Syphilis would go on to infect a veritable who's who of Europe, from Baudelaire to Gauguin to Nietzsche, not to mention numerous family members of the famously infertile Tudor and Valois families, meaning that syphilis may be responsible for many of those miserably boring dynastic power struggles of post-Columbus Europe. Anyway, nothing against syphilis, but it pales in comparison to the devastation wrought by old world diseases arriving in the New World. But the New World did have one gift for the Old World